Imagine discovering that your entire family tree was built not to branch outward, but to fold endlessly inward, generation after generation bound by blood, until heritage itself became a prison. In the deep swamps of Louisiana, one family did exactly that. The DuBois dynasty, once a name of prestige and wealth, slowly twisted into something unrecognizable. Parish records, sealed for over a century, reveal a truth so disturbing it reads less like history and more like a curse written into the very marrow of their descendants. Tonight, you will see how a legacy of faith and fortune transformed into silence, deformity, and decay. How names once celebrated in Catholic registries became whispers of shame and fear, and how more than 100 years later, science finally confirmed what priests and neighbors once only suspected, that the DuBois line had destroyed itself from within. But before we begin, I want to welcome you to Gothic Ledger. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. And if you haven't yet, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the stories that history tried to bury. In the spring of 1888, the swollen Mississippi breached its banks, pushing floodwaters through New Orleans with the weight of centuries behind it. When the waters receded, they left behind not only wreckage, but revelation. In the basement of St. Augustine Parish, where mud coated the stone floors and hymnals warped in their pews, a carpenter clearing debris struck something harder than wood. A chest, iron-banded and sealed, wedged behind the collapsed altar foundation. The archivist who pried it open days later recorded the first impressions with a kind of detached awe. The leather binding of the chest had rotted in places, the lock rusted through by years of damp air. When the lid finally yielded, a stench of mildew and stagnant water rolled upward. Inside, instead of chalices or sacramental cloths, lay stacks of brittle parchment, their edges curled, their ink still visible in streaks of brown and black. Each page bore the names of the DuBois family, written in the practiced hand of parish priests who had officiated their births and baptisms for generations. At first glance, they seemed ordinary sacramental records, no different than thousands that lined the church archives. But the archivist noticed something unusual. Markings in the margins, sometimes small crosses, sometimes circles drawn in red ink. Certain names were underlined, others marked with notations like pure, acceptable, or a solitary dash. These were not the idle flourishes of a priest, but deliberate codes. Whole columns listed parentage, godparents, and intermarriages in a manner more suited to an accountant's ledger than to the holy rite of baptism. As he laid the pages across the drying tables, a darker pattern emerged. The names repeated, looping back upon themselves. Cousins stood as godparents, uncles witnessed the births of nieces who would later become their wives. Each generation collapsed, said inward, and the red annotations seemed to highlight these intersections, as if the priest, whoever he was, had been compelled to track not faith but flesh. Later testimony revealed the chest had been deliberately hidden. One aging cleric, pressed for explanation, admitted that a former parish priest had sealed the records away to protect both the family and the church. His words carried less reassurance than warning. He claimed the notes had been meant for private study, to keep watch over a lineage that had become a danger to itself. The decision to bury the chest beneath stone had not been accidental. It had been an act of concealment. As the pages dried, the archivist realized he was not holding a genealogy, nor even a religious record, but something far more clinical and unsettling. This was a document of control, bloodlines measured, deviations recorded, purity tracked with obsessive vigilance. What they found was not genealogy. It was a map of decay. The story of the DuBois did not begin in the grand manor that later stood half-submerged in swamp. Its roots lay in 1720, when French settlers pushed into the Louisiana lowlands with little more than faith, tools, and a determination to replicate the social orders they had left behind. Parish records from that year list just 19 family names, the original settlers who carved farms along the bayous and raised the first chapels from cypress wood. For these families, isolation was not only geographical but spiritual. The Catholic Church in the New World enforced its sacraments with exacting care. Each baptism, each marriage, each burial was inscribed in ink, the register becoming both scripture and surveillance. These records, fragile and water-stained now, show a closed circle from the very beginning. DuBois' children were baptized with cousins standing as godparents, uncles signed as witnesses, nieces entered into arranged unions with their kin. By the second generation, the parish registry begins to repeat itself like a chant. The same surnames appear over and over, pairing in permutations that narrowed with each decade. The handwriting of successive priests reveals the monotony. Lines of intermarriage, signatures in the same hands across multiple pages, branches of the family tree grafted back into the trunk. To outsiders, the settlement may have appeared thriving, its pews filled, its fields cultivated. But beneath the surface, bloodlines were binding themselves into knots. Catholic insistence on preserving purity added to the enclosure. Marriage outside the parish required dispensations rarely granted, and families saw outsiders not as alliances but as threats. Wealth was measured in land in inheritance, and inheritance demanded blood be kept close. In time, closeness became indistinguishable from confinement. For the DuBois, the obsession deepened. Thus, they recorded not only baptisms and weddings, but annotations on who was suitable and who was tainted by even a distant branch of unrelated blood. To them, lineage was more than heritage. It was a system of accounting, one that allowed no deviation from its rigid columns. The effect was not immediately visible. The first children were born healthy, strong enough to farm, fight, and marry, but the record itself carried the seed of what would follow. Priests who looked back across the pages would later remark on the narrowing of names, the claustrophobic looping of unions that circled back upon the same handful of ancestors. The DuBois were not alone in this. All 19 families partook in the same ritual of insularity. But within their estate, the pattern took root with a particular fervor, one that outlasted its neighbors. Generations later, when outsiders glanced through the parish registry, the discovery was unmistakable. In a community that had grown to hundreds of souls, every baptism, every confirmation, every grave could be traced back, not to a wide foundation, but to the same small circle of kin. In a community of hundreds, every bloodline led back to the same 19 names. By the 1790s, the DuBois estate had grown into a sprawling plantation bordered not by fences, but by the slow-moving waters of the bayou. Its patriarch, Pierre DuBois, was a man both respected and feared in the parish, a landowner who saw faith and family as interchangeable, and who viewed blood as an asset to be guarded with the same vigilance as silver or land. His journals, preserved in the brittle pages of calfskin, reveal less about affection than calculation. In one entry dated 1792, he listed his daughters not by their names, but by their marriageable value. To Pierre, marriage was not a covenant of love, but a contract to preserve both fortune and Catholic identity. He wrote that an outsider dilutes both faith and land, and warned that his daughters' futures lay not in broadening the family's reach, but in circling it tighter. Land deeds from the era confirm the pattern. Transactions were written less as exchanges than as reinforcements, consolidating DuBois holdings by marrying cousins whose inheritances could be folded back into the estate. Notarial records describe dowries transferred like livestock, with property moving from one DuBois branch to another, always remaining within the dynasty. The parish registry shows the cost of this doctrine. Names once varied, Broussard, Arnaud, Desmarais, fell away, leaving only DuBois repeated across pages. Cousins became spouses, uncles became in-laws, and by the turn of the century, the family tree no longer branched outward, but folded in upon itself. The priests officiating these unions noted the sameness, their signatures weary beneath ceremonies that seemed less sacred than transactional. Isolation amplified the creed. The estate, hemmed in by bayou waters, became a world apart. Roads that linked the parish to New Orleans grew busier with trade and immigrants, but the DuBois rarely ventured beyond their land. Mainlibo spoke of evenings when the windows of the manor glowed with candlelight, yet no music nor laughter carried from within, only the occasional sound of chanting prayers in French, as if the family were keeping vigil over itself. Outsiders, whether traders or travelers, were received with suspicion and rarely welcomed back. Even in moments of broader change, the DuBois remained immovable. The revolutions that shook Europe and the colonies were distant echoes, noted in Pierre's journals only as potential risks to property. He wrote more about rainfall than about liberty, more about contracts than about human struggle. His greatest concern was that his daughters' marriages seal rather than scatter the fortune he had amassed. The creed endured long after Pierre's death, etched into both practice and expectation. To outsiders, the DuBois appeared wealthy, devout, and orderly, but those who examined the records more closely could see what lay beneath. They were not protecting wealth, they were preserving themselves. In the winter of 1807, the DuBois estate welcomed the birth of twins, an event that should have been a cause for celebration in a family that measured its worth in lineage. But the delivery, recorded in both family journals and the parish baptismal registry, did not unfold as expected. The midwife's notes, preserved in fading script, mention one child born sturdy, with full cry and strength in the chest. The other, delivered minutes later, arrived in silence. The boy's features were described in clinical detachment, a jaw split and twisted, limbs shortened, the skull uneven as if pressed from within. The midwife marked simply, malformed. The family responded with speed that suggested long-standing preparedness. The healthy twin was presented to the parish priest in daylight, carried to the chapel with hymns sung, water poured, and witnesses gathered. His name entered the registry with the flourish of approval, his godparents drawn from cousins already entangled in the web of kinship. The other twin was not celebrated. He was baptized at night in secrecy, with only the priest, the midwife, and two reluctant family witnesses present. The priest wrote the name in smaller script, almost hesitant, and beside it in the margin a single word: judgment. That word, still visible in the archival records, was not meant for ceremony, but for posterity, a reminder that even within the sacraments, this child was seen as a mark against the family's creed of purity. No announcement was made. The malformed twin was kept within the manor, hidden from the parish congregation. Servants and enslaved workers whispered of the child's cries, echoing faintly through shuttered windows, quickly stilled by a nurse's hand. Neighbors who visited for trade began to murmur when they saw only one infant carried in public. Stories spread in the fields and along the bayou that the DuBois had been cued for marrying too close, that God himself had marked their line. The family buried the truth beneath silence. The patriarch entered only a single line in his journal. 2 sons born this year. One thrives, one lives under God's mystery. Nothing more was ever written of the second twin. No grave marker survives, only a gap in the cemetery plots, where small stones stood in rows. For outsiders, the DuBois estate remained impenetrable, its candlelit windows glowing across the water. For those inside, the event became a wound folded into secrecy, a memory whispered about but never confronted. It was the first undeniable sign that the creed of preservation carried consequences, though the family refused to see it as anything more than divine chastisement. One twin baptized in daylight, the other in darkness. By the 1830s, the DuBois family had accumulated not only land, but a meticulously kept archive of its unions. Among the papers recovered in later years was a slim, leather-bound book known as the Marriage Ledger. Unlike the parish registers, which offered the formality of sacraments, this ledger bore the blunt intimacy of private calculation. Its pages, brittle and water-stained, told a story more chilling than any sermon or contract. The entries were written in a hand both neat and unfeeling, names of cousins linked to cousins, uncles bound to nieces, contracts written as if balancing columns of a merchant's account. Each union was annotated in the margins with a system of judgment that required no explanation to those who wrote it. Some pairings were marked pure, circled in red ink with satisfaction. Others bore the word acceptable, a grudging acknowledgement of necessity. The rare marriage that drew from a distant branch or weaker bloodline was marked diluted, as though human life were no more than a tincture spoiled by foreign elements. The handwriting reduced flesh and blood to numbers, purity recorded like inventory. Daughters were not described by their character or virtue, but by their lineage, which grandparents they shared, which cousin's dowry might return wealth to the estate. Sons were noted by their potential to produce heirs who would consolidate holdings, the phrase written again and again across decades of entries. Outside the bayou, Louisiana was changing. Immigrants arrived in New Orleans from Germany, Ireland, and Sicily, intermingling bloodlines, widening communities, and drawing strength from diversity. Merchants built fortunes through trade, not through the hoarding of blood. In contrast, the DuBois grew more insular, more rigid. As others expanded outward, they folded inward, their wealth measured not in commerce, but in the suffocating preservation of sameness. The ledger reveals the tightening of their circle with terrifying clarity. By 1830, over 70% of DuBois' unions were intra-family marriages. Names once distinct blurred together, branches of the family tree grafted back into the same trunk. There were no strangers in their bonds, no fresh signatures to alter the familiar hand. Each page is a reflection of a family that saw marriage not as union, but as repetition, a cycle endlessly reinforcing itself. What remains most haunting about the ledger is its lack of hesitation. There is no doubt, no moral questioning, only the cold assurance of arithmetic. Red ink sliced across the pages with confidence, as if purity could be measured like coin, as if dilution were no different than loss. When archivists read the ledger centuries later, it was not simply the names that told the story, but the silence beyond them, the absence of outsiders, the void where new blood should have entered. The DuBois had created a world in which the only acceptable partners were reflections of themselves. The DuBois did not marry, they recycled. By the middle decades of the 19th century, the DuBois estate began to echo with a different kind of sound. Not the shouts of children at play, nor the hymns of evening prayers, but a suffocating stillness broken only by the shuffle of feet and the faint whimper of those unable to form words. Parish records from this period show an unsettling pattern. Multiple baptisms annotated not with flourishing script, but with small crosses drawn beside the names. These marks, repeated across pages, signified children who did not thrive, who remained mute or unable to walk, and who often vanished from the record within a handful of years. The registers contain no causes, no explanations, only the sign of the cross, as if to consign them quietly to mystery. In some cases, even the names are missing, the entry reduced to fille or garçon, followed by a line drawn sharply across the page. When burial records are checked against these baptisms, no stones or markers appear in the family cemetery. The ground holds their bodies, but their names were never carved into stone. Inside the manor, silence grew like mold. Visitors spoke of corridors where children sat motionless, eyes unfocused, lips moving without sound. Nurses moved them from room to room, carrying frail bodies whose limbs never learned to bear weight. A daughter born in 1847 was described only as breathing, but without voice. Another son, baptized in 1851, was never mentioned again in journals or contracts after his christening day. It was as if the family had decided that what could not speak should not exist. The DuBois' explanation to outsiders was always the same: illness. They spoke of fevers, of wasting sickness, of mysterious ailments sent by God. But the repetition betrayed them. Too many children were born without words, too many limbs refused to carry, too many crosses filled the registers where names should have been celebrated. Those who lived on the estate whispered of a curse, a punishment for bloodlines that had twisted too tightly upon themselves. As the decades passed, the silence thickened. Servants reported nights when entire hallways remained hushed, even as